An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year.
How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
What I'm most worried about right now is figuring out how I can live openly and honestly.
I am finally free to be me.
I have no idea how to find friends or become a part of a community that's not religious.
What does life look like after church, after religion, after God?
That's it in a nutshell.
This is the Life After God podcast, a conversation on the space between belief and unbelief and beyond, with your host, Ryan Bell.
Hello and welcome to the Life After God podcast. My name is Ryan Bell, and I am your host. This is episode 63. Today, I'm excited to share with you my interview with John Gray, which I recorded on November 23, the day after Thanksgiving here in the U.S. Professor Gray spoke with me from his native England. He is a political philosopher with interests in analytic philosophy and the history of ideas. He retired in 2008 as school professor of European thought at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He contributes regularly to The Guardian, the Times Literary Supplement, and The New Statesman. Professor Gray is the author of numerous books, including False Dawn, The Delusions of Global Capitalism, Straw Dogs, Thoughts on Humans and Other Animals, Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion, and the Death of Utopia, and most recently, 7 Types of Atheism, which is not so much a strict typology of atheism. After all, what would such a project entail since atheism is one thing and one thing only? It is rather a fascinating, enlightening, sometimes irritating survey of the various schools of thought into which atheists have fallen in the past several centuries. Professor Gray is a controversial figure, especially for professed humanists like myself, due to his unforgiving attacks on humanism. What I hope you'll find here is a slightly more nuanced explanation of his thoughts than you may have heard before, and so let's get to it. Here is my conversation with John Gray. It seems to me that the central thesis of your book, 7 Types of Atheism, is that Western philosophy can't escape the gravitational pull of Christianity, that humanism has merely replaced Yahweh with the myth of human progress, and science is like the sacred text. Do I have that roughly correct?
Yes, you do. I'd put it the following way, that what is widely regarded at the present time, and perhaps over the last century or so, as secular thinking, involves the rejection of certain types of theistic belief, but not of the underlying way of thinking that went with theism. So people who, many, perhaps most contemporary atheists and many humanists think that by simply rejecting belief in a transcendental God that created the world and them and lays down ethical laws for all of mankind, that they've, by rejecting that set of beliefs, which comes from principally, for most of them, from Christianity, and they've stepped outside of theism. But they haven't, it seems to me, because their way of thinking still includes, in fact, has at its very center, ideas which depend on theistic assumptions and which aren't found outside of theism. For example, they assume that there's something like a kind of collective human subject, humankind, humanity, sometimes called, which has a single narrative, which has goals or aims of its own, and that history is the unfolding development of, or self-realization of that collective entity. Whereas if you lived in the ancient European world before Christianity took over, I mean in ancient Greece and Rome, of course, that idea was very weak in Greco-Roman polytheism, which didn't assume anything of the sort. It didn't assume, for example, that as history went on, human beings would converge on any single set of values. it assumed that there would be continuing conflict between human values and between different ways of life. So the idea that history is teleological, that it's got some built-in, whether it's progressive or not, by the way. I mean, most humanists have inherited a certain kind of moral optimism from Christianity, in that they see history as essentially redemptive. I mean, what distinguishes Christianity from many other religions, for example, from Buddhism or Taoism, is the supposition that salvation is possible for humans because of an historical event. In this case, Jesus coming into the human world and then being surviving death. So, I mean, pretty well all Christian denominations have the belief that human events are a coherent narrative, and they pretty well all have the idea that it's a redemptive narrative. Even Augustine, who of course criticizes literal-minded interpretations of that redemptive narrative, still thinks of human history as nonetheless morally meaningful in that way, whereas the ancient Greek and Roman historians saw history as sort of more like a natural process in which civilizations arise, they grow up, they reach maturity, they then get old and weak and die, and are replaced by barbarism for a time, or then by another civilization. So that the idea of history as being a kind of a narrative of redemption, which is found in pretty well nearly all the contemporary atheists and humanists, is an inheritance from Christianity. It's not only that it's an inheritance, because they could say, you know, if you had a philosopher sitting between us, they would say, well, the fact that that's where that idea comes from doesn't mean it's false. But I don't think it's really coherent, the idea of history, human history, as a redemptive story without some kind of backing of the kind that Christian theism gave it.
Do you think that it's just sort of a coincidence that this sort of redemptive view of history has had the ascendancy in Western philosophy for the last several hundred years, or do you think there's something about the human animal that longs for this kind of coherence, this kind of narrative coherence, and then sort of seeks out a story that makes sense of the absurdity of life?
No, I don't think it's a universal human characteristic to look for meaning in history as a whole, because most human beings didn't until the emergence of Christianity and then of post-Christian humanism. There's nothing like that in Indian civilization, not much in Chinese, Japanese civilization. It's really only in the theistic faiths, and the belief that the secular belief that history has this character of meaning is definitely nothing like universal, because it only really arises with the beginnings of the decay of Christianity in Europe in the 18th century. I mean, it emerges a little bit before within Christianity in postmillennialism, with which you will be familiar. The idea that the idea that humans can improve the world, and it's after that improvement has taken place that Jesus returns and so on. But in the more secular forms of the European Enlightenment, you're really talking about just the last few centuries. So, I mean, I find it very implausible, extremely implausible, to imagine that this small section of human experience in one civilization in the world, one part of civilization, of a single civilization in the world, over the last 200 or 300 years, should reveal some universal or perennial human need. Certainly, humans seek meaning in their lives; they try to make it, but that doesn't at all necessarily involve the idea that human history is meaningful. I mean, you don't find that. You don't find it in Homer.
Right. Yeah, it's very absurd in Homer. He sort of just lucks out on his way home.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a
Odysseus.
series of it's a series of struggles and chances and mischances, and there's a personal narrative of Odysseus and of his relations with others that he interacts with, but there's no universal narrative. That's a very late development. And I think it's a development from within theism and from within Christianity as a whole. But of course, now that Western thinking and even Western culture has been dominated by it for the last couple of centuries, many people really can't do without it. They find the view of history, which actually is often presented in Shakespeare, in this respect in Lear and other of his more tragic plays, stepping outside, I think, of Christianity altogether. And they find that intolerable and can't live with it. But most of humankind hasn't been like that. I mean, most of humankind has either thought that meaning was guaranteed in history, was guaranteed by a transcendental power, God, or they haven't thought that there was any meaning in human history as a whole at all, and it wasn't at all tragic. It didn't even occur to them as a possibility. So, and this is why, I mean, one of the reasons that people find it very difficult to understand what I mean, even though I've reformulated dozens of times. I've more or less given up now. If they don't want to understand, that's their problem. They can read someone else instead. When I say that there's no progress, I mean for them it's obvious that there's progress in a variety of ways. They think of technical progress, the fact that the drugs they buy at the drugstore are better and often cheaper than they were before, that they have smartphones. They think there's moral progress as well, because otherwise they wouldn't be themselves, would they? I mean, they nearly always think of themselves as embodiments of, however imperfect, of moral progress. But of course, what's meant by denying progress is just to reassert a human orthodoxy which existed in most civilizations in the world for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, which would say, yes, there are periods of advance in which universal human goods are increased. You can have societies become richer, more knowledgeable, more peaceful, and then they start to decay. In other words, if you went back again to not only the ancient Greeks but the ancient Indians and others, you would find and Romans, you would find the idea taken as a commonplace that there were periods of advance in human events, in human history, but that they were regularly undone by permanent flaws in human beings, so that although there is advance in human knowledge, for example, it doesn't make human beings any more reasonable. Although there are even advances in human civilization, the quality of human civilization, they don't last very long. They tend to be followed by periods of decline or barbarism. That very simple idea is in fact too simple for practically anyone to understand now, although it was the idea that was taken for granted by pretty well everyone in the world until about 200 or 300 years ago. And the reason that it's hard, one reason that it's hard to understand, apart from historical parochialism, is that most post-Christians, and perhaps even many Christians these days, derive a substantial part of the meaning of their own lives from that belief. If you take it away, in other words, you could say, well, yes, you can do good in particular contexts, what William Blake called minute particulars, but the good that you achieve in society will benefit people for several generations. But as the society or the civilization grows older or comes up against intractable problems, it'll be washed away. It'll be swept away by barbarism or some disaster. That idea, which was a commonplace, as I say, in the ancient world, is just too much for people to understand now, so they can't understand that simple commonplace. Although, if you take a large enough, not 300 years, but say 3,000 years, it's amply corroborated by human history. And even in the history of the 20th century, was a history of utter disasters in Europe, from the First World War onwards, interwar fascism leading to Nazism, disaster in Russia and then in the Soviet state that followed, colossal losses of life, followed by further disasters in Maoism and so forth. And now, from saying that something like what is now underway couldn't happen, in other words, the reemergence of types of fascism or neo-fascism in Europe and of the far right in America, the partial undoing of liberal civilization.